Greetings and welcome. This is, I think, segment 8 on the use of color and color interface in Cuis Smalltalk. And this segment is going to be on the color editor panel. And again, this allows us to go through and select various colors. While this is in the RGB plane, this is one slice through a color cube, and this little dot here is this bit of this pixel here, and this is actually the view of one pixel perpendicular to this plane. So as we move a slider up and down, we're actually taking different cuts through that color, the RGB color cube, all centered around this particular spot. And we can do the usual drag and drop things. I can drop something here. I can drop something back. I can change and make a change here, and then take this and drop over here, whatever. And so the idea is we want to make this convenient and reactive, and we've got some radio buttons that do different things. And so here's the RGB cube, and then hue, saturation, brightness. We've got two different models of these sorts of things, and we're putting up the closest web color, CSS3 web color, and we can always bring that over, and so we can find something close to a web color and then use that exact color or whatever. And so the question is, how is this put together? What are the mechanics of this? And so I'm going to go again from the UI on the outside in. And so if I command click, which for me is a middle click, I get a color editor panel, which doesn't, which just sounds useful. And within that, we're going to have a layout morph, and the layout's going to have three areas within it. This first layout morph has this area which has a color pane morph, and then it has the RGB stuff here. The second layout has the slider, and then this third area has the particular radio groups, the two radio groups, and then in a separate layout down here, the layout for keeping all of this sort of fit. And when we go and make a change in size, then things scale to fit. And then there's sort of a minimum size for these things, which is actually the natural size to view this at. But no reason to make it that restrictive. Okay, so color editor panel. I'm going to go ahead and grab an inspector, and again, being lazy, I'm going to say, we can look at all that stuff, but I'm going to say self class and do it. Oh, sorry, print it. And I'm going to, rather than copying that somewhere or something else, I'm going to say browse, and now we've got a color editor panel. And to see where that fits in its place in the world in the inheritance hierarchy, I'm going to bring a hierarchy browser. Here we see a color editor panel as a kind of panel, which is a pluggable morph, which is inherits imported rect morph inherits from rectangle like morph, which of course is a morph. And panel is a simple thing that is basically the window with a title and a layout inside, and it has some color information and whether or not we've got this little push pin for staying up and that sort of thing. And the interesting thing here is subclass responsibility, which is called build morphic window. And the reason I wanted to show this is that it's a common pattern as part of the GUI building. If we take a look here at implementers, we can see that there are a number of, users of this. Let's see if I can drag it down a little bit. Okay, and so you see we've got all kinds of people that do build morphic windows, that call build morphic window, and the different builders do different things. But if we then actually take a look at senders, which is what I really wanted to do, then you can see the panel does a fairly common pattern for Windows, which is it creates a window with a model and does this build morphic window. Say, hey, build yourself. The model contains the state, the structural mechanics as remembered and used by any kind of editing operation. And then we have a real estate agent that that goes ahead and opens it in the world and makes sure it's visible and that sort of thing. It decides where the window is going to pop up and that sort of thing. And so if we look at a system window, we see something very similar. A system window, again, is very generic. It has a model, which is where the information about what that's retained is there, and it does a build morphic window and like that. So all of the children of system window, or actually I guess I should show that too. But anyway, just another hierarchy there. There's a whole most of the things like these browser panels are all system windows, and they do a few more things than the panels do. So panel is like a simplified system window. Panels basically just come up here. They've got this label line, and then they do whatever they do on their layout there. So that's sort of the top bits there. So again, back to the color editor panel. Okay, so we get a row of columns and left padding. We build a color pane, we build a slider, and we build a radio button column, and we set the background color. And now when any of these components changes because the user comes in and clicks on something, when we interact with this thing, we send refresh color to ourself. So again, this is using the event system so that rather than having code in here when you click on something, then code has to say, oh, I have to update all these other sorts of things. And if you come over here, then you've got code that says, oh, I've got to update all these guys plus this guy over here. Or you click on something up here and say, oh, gee, I have to, What you have is you have a bunch of components that say, oh, I'm just hanging out here. Oh, I've got a color changed event. I have to update my view of the world because the world's changed. And so what I will do is I will go to the model, I'll find out what the current color is, and then I will do what makes sense. So we have like a color pane morph, and again, when color changed, it updates from color pane. So the rest of this bit of business has to do with layouts, and you know about layouts, and so basically it's the positioning of all of these elements, and that's pretty straightforward. And since you can just play with that with just morphs to figure out how you want to lay something out and then put it together. By the time you've got something that looks nice to you, then all you have to do is then reproduce that in the code that's invoked from the build morphic window. And so like the radio button column, okay, we've got a radio group from red, green, blue, and a radio group hue, saturation, brightness. And when somebody clicks on it, then we have to have a new radio selection, so we inform about that. And so again, we're registering interest on certain events. And then when those events happen, then we update ourselves. And so one color change, say, refresh value from, okay, and so forth. And so these are just ways of communicating, and when somebody clicks on one of these buttons, then we have to say, oh, there's some things I have to do, and then I inform the rest of the world that something changed, and then they can go ahead and update themselves. And so it's a much more egalitarian way of doing those sorts of things. And I guess the interesting thing here then is something like the color pane. And so, hello, oh well, I want to go ahead and browse the color pane. Oops, sorry. It's middle click. Oh, sorry, right click. Don't mind me. My fingers know what I'm doing, even my head doesn't. And browse that. Okay, so just a color pane. This is where the mechanics happens. I'm just going to show the class comment here. So that's just the pane in the color cube typically, and there are some algorithmics about how this gets set up. And if we take a look at the initialization, we create a form and make a focus morph, which is that little donut, and we keep track of the selector. And let's see if one of these, nope, that's not it, that's not it. Dropping, grabbing, change processing, refresh form. Here we are. Okay, so here, just again, this if you take a look at the Wikipedia articles on color, you can see in terms of the color cube, you then go through and you say, well, gee, I'm taking the color from 0 to 255, and or whatever it happens to be, and I'm laying out that color in a form, and X goes from 0 to 255, Y goes from 0 to 255, and for each of those I've got the XY density of color on that particular color plane. And you can take a look at that for all the mechanics. And when we get clicked upon, then we go ahead and say, oh yeah, we go ahead and try to put a little donut up that has shows where the focus is, and say we reset the focus and let everybody know about that and update themselves. So that's pretty good. The model itself is very simple, and it just knows its color, and it can get asked for its color, and asked to set the color, and just remember what's going on there. So the state holder, it's just a perfect, fairly simple bit of business in this particular thing. So that's really the overview. You can now that you know how to get there, you can go through and see the mechanics of how these areas are set up, and what happens when you go through and click and drag on these sorts of things. Okay, now you can see little hiccup there, but basically, so that's it. So that's ColorEditor panel, and it's actually I think despite all the bits of business going on, all the bits of state, it's actually a fairly simple thing. And so I invite you to click around and find out, take a look at the code. And so my little Easter egg, which is going to be the next segment, is to be getting into drag and drop behavior palettes and a little bit of how that works, and that's again something I'm just playing with. It's in GitHub. There's a Ken Dickey uh, repository selection, which has something called Cuis Smalltalk baby steps, and so we'll take a look at some of my baby steps next time. And that is that. See you next time.